When the Legends Die, Chapter 6. Winter is long in the high country, and the short white days can bring black hunger. But the Ute people have lived in many generations, many grandmothers in that land. They speak its language. Before ice locked the valleys, Bessie and the boy gathered willow shoots and black stem ferns and inner bark and ripe grasses for her winter basketry. She made rawhide, and her man cut ironwood and shaped frames on which she wove the thongs, the webs for snowshoes. He made a new bow, and he shaped and feathered arrows. Before the snow had built its depths in the valleys, he went to the thickets where the deer were feeding and took fresh meat while the deer still had their fat. He taught the boy to set snares for rabbits. Then, when the drifts lay deep and the cold shriveled the rocks and shrank the days, she kept the stew pot full and simmering. She made winter moccasins and winter leggings and shirts, and when she had done these things, she wove baskets. And she told the old tales and sang the old songs. Winter passed. New leaves came again to the aspens, then to the oaks, and the surging streams quieted, and the spring was upon them. They fished, they picked service berries, then chokeberries. They made meat and dried it, and the boy was big enough to help with all these things. When the leaves fell and ice came and snow whitened Pagosa Peak once more, another winter passed, and its wailing storms, its roaring snow slides, its shrunken days, and no one came, neither Blue Elk, nor the sheriff, nor anyone looking for them. Again the aspens were in leaf. The mariposa lilies bloomed, and the cotton grass came to blossom in deep, cool meadows on the high benches. They gathered food. They lived as their people had lived in the old days. And a third time the aspens turned to gold and showered leaves on the lodge he had made as she wanted it, round like the year. He looked at the boy, now almost as tall as his mother, and he said, "One more winter and he can go with me and kill deer in the thickets." She said, "He sings the song for taking deer. He helps you now with the songs." And, she smiled, "he takes rabbits." She was proud of her son. The winter was half over. It was a winter of much snow, more snow than usual, even for that country. The snow had driven the deer to still lower valleys, and for some days there had been little meat in the lodge. Then he said, "Tomorrow I must go and find the deer." She said, "Tonight we will sing the song," and they did that. The next morning he put on his snowshoes and took the heaviest bow and best arrows and set out. He said he was going to go over the ridge into the valley beyond, and that he might be gone overnight because it was a long trip and because he would be loaded with meat when he came back. He went up the slope to cross the gully, an hour's travel from the lodge, then to cross the next ridge. It was a hot sun morning after a brittle cold night. He had been gone the space of an hour when she heard the thunder sound. It was the voice of an avalanche, a big snowslide. She went outside and saw the plume of fine snow, and it was like a cloud over a big slide, and she knew that the night's freeze had loosened the ice on the high ledges, and the morning sun had started to trickle somewhere, a trickle that was like wet mud under a moccasin. The slide came lunging down the mountainside. She saw where it was coming, and she clapped a hand over her mouth. She cried out once in horror, and the boy heard and came and stood beside her, watching as the snow plume floated all the way down the slope, and the thunder of the slide echoed into silence. It had gone down the gully an hour's travel from the lodge. She moaned with a grief known as clearly as though she had been there and seen what happened. She said to the boy, "Now we must make mourning, but first we must go and find him." They returned to the lodge and dressed for the journey. They put on snowshoes and they went up the slope, following her man's tracks. They went to the top of the slope, and there was the gully, swept as clean as the floor of the lodge. Not one tree was left standing. It was a giant furrow, plowed by the slide as her man once plowed furrows in the soil for his cornfields and on the reservation. Far down in the valley, they saw the great heap of snow and rocks and broken trees where the slide had run itself out, piled upon itself. They had followed his tracks here, to the edge of this great furrow. Now she and the boy went down into the slide furrow and crossed to the other side, and they looked for his tracks. There were no tracks. They searched, and he had not been there. He had not crossed the gully. He'd come into it, but he had not crossed it. They went down to the place where the slide had run itself out. They went along the jumbled face of it, looking. They found nothing. At last she said, "Come," and they started back toward the ridge to return to the lodge. They were almost at the foot of the ridge when the boy shouted and pointed to something in the snow. He ran and stood beside it till she came up to him. It was an arrow, a hand's breadth of its shaft sticking from the snow as though it had been shot from the air. It was one of his arrows. They dug in the snow and found another arrow. Finally, they found him. He had been caught by the slide, crushed by it, then thrown up by its own convulsions until he was near the surface when it came to a halt. They found his body, and they stood beside it, crying for him, and the boy sang the wailing song for the dead. She had not taught him that song. He had that song in his heart, and he sang it. Then she got the broken body over her shoulder, and they went up out the great furrow and climbed the slope, step by heavy step, and carried him home to the lodge. And all that night they made mourning. The next day she dressed him in new leggings and a new shirt. They wrapped him in a blanket and a deerskin. She chose her best blankets and filled them with dried berries and smoked fish and cured meat. She made a drag out of the deerskin, looped long thongs to it, and on that skin drag they hauled him up the mountain to a cave beyond the rocks. They put him in the cave and set the baskets of food beside him, that he might eat on his long journey. They gave him burial in the old ways. They sang the death songs for him in the darkness and the stars watching them. Then they went down the mountain, back to the lodge. She said to the boy, "Now you are the man."